Today marks the 100th anniversary of the October Revolution. This might confuse you, as today is November 7th. The discrepancy of dates is directly caused by Russia still having been on the old Julian calendar in 1917, but indirectly, more profoundly, the October Revolution's November birth date exemplifies the central fact of communism: it's a lie from the very beginning. Despite representing a tiny minority of political forces at work in the February Revolution to oust Russia's Romanov dynasty, and constituting only the majority of the most extreme leftist elements among the Russian revolutionaries, Vladimir Lenin called his faction Bolshevik, which means one of the majority. Now, speaking of lies, to commemorate this day, the Washington Post ran a 4,700-word piece titled, "100 Years Later, Bolshevism is Back, and We Should Be Worried." Yeah, I'd be worried about that. That's pretty scary. You might assume that the Washington Post article described the recent spate of New York Times pieces extolling the virtues of communism. Here are some headlines. What killed the promise of Muslim communism? Are Christians supposed to be communists? No, spoiler alert, no. Or why women had better sex under socialism. You might presume that the Washington Post discussed the terrifying recent poll that showed that the majority of American millennials would rather live in a communist, socialist, or fascist nation than a capitalist nation, than a nation where you have freedom. But no, that is not what the Washington Post talk about. Instead, in this nearly 5,000-word article, they accused Republican President Donald Trump, whose administration has overseen massive deregulation, enforcement of democratically enacted law, the appointment of textualist judges faithful to the Constitution, a bold and nuanced foreign policy that has thus far avoided the disastrous bellicosity of Barack Obama's regime, robust defense of civil rights and religious liberty. No. They accused that President Trump of being a neo-Bolshevik. The Washington Post, ladies and gentlemen. Democracy dies in darkness. Fake news at its finest. Vladimir Lenin is said to have called communist sympathizers in America useful idiots. The phrase refers to people like New York Times reporter Lincoln Steffens, who traveled to the Soviet Union shortly after the revolution and claimed, quote, "I have seen the future and it works." Or New York Times reporter Walter Duranty, I'm seeing a trend here, New York Times reporter Walter Duranty, who won the Pulitzer Prize for publishing Stalin's propaganda denying the Holodomor that starved to death 7.5 million people. Or Anne Applebaum, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who penned today's insipid twaddle in the Washington Post. All allegedly expert thought leaders on a subject about which they wrote in such ignorance. The Russian Revolution led to the death of at least 94 million people as communism infected nations around the world. It enslaved half of the globe. Yet much of the left in America remains unrepentant in their support of tyranny.
And finally, new rule: Fidel Castro is not worse than vampire Hitler. And Cuba is not North Korea crossed with hell. If we had opened up relations with Cuba 30 years ago, instead of pursuing the stupidest, most ineffective policy in American history, not named the drug war, today Cuba would look like St. Bart's, and your kid would be there on spring break, drinking rum out of a jug shaped like a frog.
People in sinecures like yours, affluent, protected people in Western countries where they can speak their minds, who defend this guy. I've never met anybody who fled from Cuba who would defend him.
Because, well, the ones who have fled for a number of reasons, sometimes for personal reasons. They left their wives behind. They want to start a new life with a new wife, forget about the old family. You don't hear about that in the media there. And nationalism, the Cuban
So you're saying that people who fled Castro were abandoning their families?
Some of them,
because they had like a girlfriend.
Some want to begin a new life there. Some of them were. So there's not this huge system of political oppression that is very popular among certain sectors there.
In 1985, you praised the Sandinista government, and you said that Daniel Ortega was an impressive guy. This is what you said about Fidel Castro. Let's listen.
You may recall way back in, 1961, they invaded Cuba. And everybody was totally convinced that Castro was the worst guy in the world, that all the Cuban people were going to rise up in rebellion against Fidel Castro. They had forgotten that he educated their kids, gave them health care, totally transformed the society.
Useful idiots like Bernie Sanders at the end. I'm sure you could tell, because he sounds exactly the same as he did then, both in content and in voice, but that was Bernie about 30 years ago. Useful idiots. Men of character and moral clarity saw this evil for what it was as it began. People all the time quote the Iron Curtain line of Winston Churchill's speech, "The Sinews of Peace," but they often neglect his prescription for how to fight this ideology of lies.
Be blind to the fact that the liberties enjoyed by individual citizens throughout the United States and throughout the British Empire are not valid in a considerable number of countries, some of which are very powerful. In these states, control is enforced upon the common people by various kinds of all-embracing police governments to a degree which is overwhelming and contrary to every principle of democracy. The power of the state is exercised without restraint, either by dictators or by compact oligarchies operating through a privileged party and a political police. But we must never cease to proclaim in fearless tones the great principles of freedom and the rights of man, which are the joint inheritance of the English-speaking world, that freedom of speech and thought should reign, that courts of justice, independent of the executive, unbiased by any party, should administer laws which have received the broad assent of large majorities or are consecrated by time and custom. Let us preach what we practice. Let us practice what we preach.
Perfectly said, perfectly summed up by Winston Churchill. We must not only practice what we preach, we also have to preach what we practice. Yet from the American left, all too often we hear, "Liberty for me, but not for thee." From atop the shoulders of the giants who built our civilization on ordered liberty and human dignity, they preach against the spiritual and philosophical foundation of that society that they enjoy, of the life that they live. They are the sophisters, economists, and calculators that Edmund Burke warned us about. But some men understood Churchill's vision, and they saw through the degrading materialism of communist ideologies.
Winston Churchill said the destiny of man is not measured by material computations. When great forces are on the move in the world, we learn we're spirits, not animals. And he said there's something going on in time and space and beyond time and space, which, whether we like it or not, spells duty. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
Communism deprives man of his dignity because it pretends that man is an animal. That's why where conservatives see people, leftists only see the masses, the unwashed masses. How often do you hear that phrase? The more they love mankind, the less they love men in particular. G.K. Chesterton understood that communism relies on a central lie, which comes from the father of lies, and he explained the strange fruit of this mystical religion of materialism. He wrote, quote, "The Marxian talks as if the only object of saving people from sufferings inflicted by the, quote, blind forces of capitalism was that those people should have material consumption and material security. It is not. It is that they should have life and that they should have it more abundantly. It is not only that a man should be secure of eating the turnip, it is that he should have authority over the turnip and liberty with the turnip and the right to choose his own way of cooking the turnip. For that sense of dignity makes all the difference to his general view of life and of that heaven which fills the empty spaces and the idle hours. On this 100th anniversary of Lenin's lies, let's redouble our efforts to defend the liberty and dignity that make life worth living and to rebuff the useful idiots who propagate those lies at every chance that we possibly can.